little party trick too.
I think we're live now. You want to do the party trick now?
No, I'll save it. I'll put it in my back pocket. It's for Pi Day.
Oh, you're gonna save it for later?
Yeah.
Oh no! Look, my Wi-Fi is still on. I forgot to check that before we started. You got your stuff going, don't you? You good?
I'm good. I'm good.
You want to do the party trick in this video, like later in this video, or some other time?
Yeah, I'll do it.
It is Pi Day.
Okay. All right. I'll do it now.
Okay. Happy Pi Day to everybody.
I'm not ready. I'm not ready for the setup. What do they call it? What are the 3 stages of a trick? Have you seen the movie Prestige? The Prestige?
I have seen the movie The Prestige, but I saw it while I was deployed, so I forgot all the details.
So I'm only superstitious about like a couple things. One of them is the number 14. Is the first number I got when I played soccer when I was a kid. And I literally would refuse to play on a team if I couldn't have number 14.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Just straight up. Like I played soccer in college and I would not go to any other school. I wouldn't have gone to Northeastern if they didn't guarantee that I would have number 14. It was like, so I'm still to this day pretty superstitious about it.
Yeah.
But so because of that, I've imposed that onto the Bible. And so any chapter and verse that's like chapter 3 verse 14, like that kind of stuff is special to me. Like, so I remember like, you know, different stuff. But if you look at in Matthew, right? So the party trick is this. Genesis 3. Where is it? So
3:14.
3:14 is right before the proto-evangelium.
Proto-evangelium, yeah.
Yeah. And then Genesis 3:14 is where God says, I am that I am. Exodus. Okay. Exodus 3:14.
Okay. Yeah.
And then when you get all the way to the book of Matthew in the generations of Christ, it's God manifest in the flesh coming full circle, right? 3.14, because it's 3 generations of 14.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So in my Bible, you know, like when I had a regular or
a paper Bible,
I have written all over Matthew, like that first page, like 3.14 pi. It's the rule of pi. So it is
3 14,
generations
14.
Of, yeah, 3 sets of 14.
My party trick is much less cerebral than that.
That's cerebral.
To me, it is.
It's superstitious, dude.
So it's kind of fun.
Totally superstitious.
If you read the books on numerology by Ruckman and people like that, then you'll start seeing things. You know, it foregrounds certain things. It puts it in your salience landscape, whether or not it should be there. It does put it in your salience landscape. There's this famous restaurant in Alabama called Lambert's Cafe, and they are very famous for throwing bread rolls across the restaurant at you, and you have to catch them. And that's what they're famous for. And even on the billboard, it says "Home of the Throwed Rolls." And so everyone in Alabama knows that. And so when I lived in Alabama, one of the verses that I would take people to, I would tell people kind of as an icebreaker that Lambert's Cafe is prophesied in the Bible. And if you go to Zechariah chapter 5, verse 1, he says, I looked and behold a flying roll. I'm like, look, he had to be in Lambert's Cafe.
Yeah. Yep. So I take this. So the whole reason why this became salient to me was because I've basically all of my biblical foundation is through Ruckman. So like the numerology is a thing that's salient to me. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? That's like my eschatology, all of the theological mumbo jumbo.
All the ologies.
Yeah, all the ologies are basically springboard off Ruckman for me.
Right. And then you got to
develop
and change from there.
Which I like. But at the same time, so I take like the 3.14 rule and I apply it to like Joshua 3:14, I think it is.
I don't know what else it would be.
Because here's the thing, in Joshua 3:14, I just want to make sure of this. I'm so superstitious with this.
And it came to pass when the people removed from their tents to pass over Jordan, the priests bearing the ark of the covenant before the people.
Yeah, it was about spiritual circumcision. This is it's 16.
3:16 or 16:14.
They get circumcised before they go over the Jordan. But he meets the captain of the Lord's host. Is it 5:14? Yeah, it is 5:14. Anyway, I was just trying to make all these connections with it, with like spiritual circumcision as a circle being like a 3.14 thing. You know,
there is a place in I forget where it is, but they're giving the dimensions of the brazen altar, of the brazen wash bin.
Yeah.
And if you take the dimensions, it looks like a contradiction, but one of them's given the dimensions on the inside, one of them's given dimensions on the outside, and the rim is the hand breadth around. So if you take the number of cubits and you figure for that hand breadth, the difference is exactly pi, 3.14.
Yes, I know. Look, see, so here's Matthew. Right?
Yeah.
Can you see that? Pi. Yeah. And what that says right there is the temple bath circumference equals 3.14.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what I have noted there. Yeah.
So you had a conversation with Seraphim Winslow recently, and I think he's in the chat today, so we had to watch what we say. So your impression. So I'll just tell you this, leading off of this. In our audience, we have a gamut of people. As you know, we have a gamut of people. I came from a very fundamentalist background, and I started the channel, Beyond the Fundamentals. I mean, really back in 2008, really started putting more content on there, 2013, 2014. And then 2015 started doing some stuff with regard to Calvinism. And then I came across, started expanding my mind after a divorce and encounter with John Vervaeke and those people, probably around 2018 or so. And so I've been on a journey like this, and I don't know how far my audience is coming along with me, but what I notice as we're doing this Friends of Wisdom thing, we are intentionally getting people from a variety of different backgrounds who have different perspectives on things, and necessarily they're going to run afoul of the fundamentalist type propositions that we come across. You know, it was really eye-opening for me as I knew there was something wrong with Calvinism. I had to wake up one day and realize that whatever was wrong with Calvinism at the root level was also wrong with me. And what I later, I didn't have I knew it was something. I knew that there was a similarity there, even though I didn't know what it was. And what I found it later to be was, you know, propositional paradigmatic entrapment without realizing there are other kinds of knowing. Basically, you know, the mechanisms of discovery of information are the same mechanisms of deception, of self-deception. And once I figured that out, I realized, wow, if I'm going to be against this thing, I also have to be against what I once was as well. And then how far does that rabbit hole go? It's not exactly clear. So we got some feedback, probably, maybe, I don't know if it's the most. I mean, I get a lot of negative feedback from a lot of people all the time, but it kind of raises my eyebrows a bit when I get some negative feedback from I guess people that I know have been following along and very supportive for several years. And so we got a lot of raised eyebrows, ruffled feather. I was talking to Paula before this session. I said, this is the ruffled feathers follow-up. RFF, where
Yeah.
where let's go back and talk about this. And what I kind of want to try to do is drag my audience with me in a way that we can cross a threshold into seeing other perspectives and gain wisdom from them without feeling like we have to be entrapped by any propositions, either that we feel like are being challenged or that somebody else holds. Yeah. Let's look at a how here. We're looking at how do we Seraphim just said it's 3:14 in California when we said his name. How do we dialogue?
He's game, dude. He's totally game.
How do we dialogue with people that we disagree with? And then how do we walk away from that having picked up the signal that we're comfortable with while not feeling overwhelmed and dislodged from the propositions that we've attached ourselves to in such a fast way that it makes us defensive or maybe even traumatized in some cases?
Yeah. So actually, to try and answer that, at least to a certain degree, I think what might be helpful in answering that question, and practically speaking, is what we talked about the other day. Like, we've sort of somehow been able to develop and cultivate this collective intelligence through FSI.
Yeah.
Where, I don't want to speak for everybody in FSI, whether they participate in the video or even in the live chat or anything like that. But I constantly feel like all day that I'm interacting with them. And, but really the only way that I get to interact with them in a concrete way is whenever we're live on Wednesday night, or, through text messages or live chats or comments. Right. So, if we're trying to follow the Ephesians 4 model, then we have to take the no longer children tossed to and fro seriously. We have to really internalize that and understand and experience what that's like.
Yep.
And one of the ways that we might be able to do that is to give the group a sense of permanence in terms of how they interact. And so, like, I'm thinking of like some kind of server or Discord that's constantly there for people to, when they have a moment of like, where they're encountering novelty, something that's novel for them, they can submit it to the group and be like, dude, what is this about? Like,
yeah. And then other people can address that in real time on the fly.
Exactly. Yeah. Instead of maybe, hearing something crazy that you say or somebody says on a video and, being confused, having nobody to bounce that off of, so you're kind of at the whim of the limits of your own knowledge space when you're watching a video. You don't have anybody to bounce it off of that, might be able to allow you to access that perspective that is necessary for you to unlock what the person is trying to say. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And then the proper relationship to what is trying to be said,
right,
is a thing that needs to be separated from the evaluation of the content of what is said.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So we can see something that's almost like a recipe that's trying to be made, that's writing itself as it goes. And we need to treat the ingredients with kindness as they come to us, and with charity, because we don't know what's trying to be made, and we don't know what we're going to need to take to use to make something later. And so you kind of let the ingredients all present themselves before we start casting them out, because we don't know what needs to be made. And since we're talking about this video, I mean, we got Seraphim in the chat here. If you want to come on, just let me know in the chat. I'll send you an invite. You can come back on if you want, because we're going to be talking about you. Yeah, just let me know. I can do that in a heartbeat. Okay. So we have, I think, an Eastern Orthodox background here. We mentioned the Eucharist and the concept of Thanksgiving, and I might mix this in with the concept of sacraments too. Sacraments as a psychotechnology seem to be a huge thing that stood out to you.
Yeah,
now,
it did.
What happened? I had two things happen to me at the same time. If a person thinks that the sacrament is literally metaphysically, ontologically doing something for them, like conferring them grace and granting them fewer purgatory days or more time in the afterlife or something like that, that I could not identify with that, even though I could get along with it. But if you view a sacrament or a ceremony kind of like in a Girardian sense, I don't know if you're following me on that, but the concept of Rene Girard, he talks about rites of passage, initiations that tribal people would have, and you would have an initiation or a rite of passage. Say you had some great war and all the men had to do this great wonderful thing in order to save the tribe, okay? And then you would develop a ceremony or a rite of passage that goes along with that afterwards, so that everybody else could relive what those people actually went through. You see?
Yeah.
And so the reliving of it is it's a way to kind of capture. It's a way to kind of capture the event, for the sake of others to respect and honor what it brings to the society,
right?
Without actually having to spend the risk of going and doing it yourself. Right. So like when you do the Lord's Supper, whether you call it the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper, or, Catholics will call it Mass. If somebody goes to that thinking that they are doing some kind of, they're actually conferring grace upon their soul for some afterlife kind of thing. I can't really identify with that personally, but if we're just going through a ceremony to identify ourselves with what Christ went through,
right?
I think there's value in that. And as a collective psychotechnology, I also think that there's some kind of value in that as well.
Yeah, well, so we could de-religiousize it for a second, and that's kind of what making a sacrament analogous to a psychotechnology. That's kind of what it's doing, is it's de-religiousizing it in that way, where we have all kinds of rituals.
You might think of it as like a collective cognitive behavioral therapy, like a collective CBT, if you will. Does that make sense?
Yeah, or even a heuristic for spiritual growth or something like that. Like a significant moment inside of a spiritual exercise or something. So like what I'm thinking of is, I wouldn't call this a sacrament, but it's a psychotechnology in, like, you have to use, like, in order to vote. Well, maybe you don't have to, but in order for me to vote, I have to present my license, my identification
in order
card.
For you to vote.
Yeah. I have to and I live in Connecticut too. But I have to present my driver's license at the phone booth so I can go practice this sacred American ritual.
Yeah.
Right. So, and I know that it's sacred because if I don't present my license, or if I mess with the procedure of that ritual, then people get all like destabilized, right? Because it's sacred. And so understanding that that's a socialized psychotechnology of a way of identification. It's a way for the system of government or civilization to, as a collective intelligence, identify what is allowed in and what steps it has to take in order to accomplish, to go through this transformation.
Yeah, so we're looking at a practical set of steps in order to help a person's mindset be more conducive to a potential transformation.
Exactly, because when you walk out of the voting booth, hypothetically, you are fundamentally participating in the transformation of this body of people that you're participating with. And it's therefore no different than a sacrament. You know what I'm saying? So yeah.
Seraphim, welcome aboard.
Let me change my son's name here. My son's name is Theo. So
I need to go turn a fan on. I'm gonna turn my camera off just for a second so y'all don't see my belly when I get up.
So Seraphim, we were just talking about for me, it was like kind of a little bit of a bomb that you dropped, which was that Sacrament is a psychotechnology.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was really helpful to me because it de-religioused sacrament, what a sacrament is for me, and allowed me to see more of like it allowed me to see more clearly phenomenologically what's actually going on when people are, spiritually inclined people are walking through a set of procedures in order to induce or invoke some kind of transformation, right?
Yeah. Well, if anything, it should have re-religiousized the sacrament for you, because, religion is basically the Western equivalent of what in the East they call yoga. It's a linking or a yoking.
A binding.
Right. And so what you're doing when you are reenacting the conscious quality of do this in remembrance of me, that remembrance is a relinking with the fundamental basis of reality. So it's actually not anti-religion, it's like ultra religion.
Yeah, I think semantically it's difficult to explain. I think what the distinction for me anyway is that to be bound to something real that is not imaginary. And whereas previously I may have been, like if you think of integral theory, I may have been in some kind of imaginary concept with God and needed to be disabused of that. And when I revisit a religious ceremony or a sacrament, when I revisit that with a different view of God, it is completely different than how I previously viewed it.
Absolutely.
It's not doing for me what I thought it was doing, but it's doing something for me more than what I thought it was doing and different.
Yeah, it's a defamiliarization, and in that sense, an enlivening of the thing, the event.
So one of the goals of this session, so what we're doing with the Friends of Wisdom series, Seraphim, so you kind of know what we're doing. We have a large swath of the audience of Beyond the Fundamentals comes from a very dogmatic fundamentalist background, as do I. So when the ability to listen to somebody that you might propositionally disagree with and be able to also glean wisdom and signal from what they said, not everybody can do that. And so what we're trying to do is after a conversation takes place, go back and kind of pick up some stragglers a little bit, relook at some things. So let me give an example of this. When you're talking about wisdom and intelligence and rationality, and some of the language that you're using, in my mind, if we're talking about evolutionary adaptivity or ability to survive, the intelligence aspect of it, I have a lot of young earth creationists in my audience, right? And so I might not use the word evolutionary because that would scare them off. If I hear it, I can put that hat on and I can see through that lens. Not everybody can do that. And then I can take that hat off and like, well, if that isn't how things happened, what might it look like? Well, it's at least adaptivity. So as we have these conversations, there's lots of little lingo and phrases and references to things that are the boogeymen for a lot of people. So it's a challenge to try to bring people along to see through, to be able to see through a different lens and find the signal in what's being said without being scared off by something that they have been trained to avoid. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And from my point of view, actually, it's important to understand that from integral consciousness, unlike the other levels of consciousness, I don't see fundamentalism as being wrong. I actually see fundamentalism as being absolutely right. But the problem is it can't be this ontologically fixed state.
Right,
it's a stage that you pass through to another stage.
Mhm.
So, unlike like a rationalist atheist would come on and try to debate fundamentalism. And that's just wrong. We have to go through the stage of fundamentalism in order to have the cognitive groundwork to even get to integral.
Yeah, it's almost like you would have to, it's like a state. Yeah, I don't know a way to say it better than how you just said it, but I see that in my own life. Sometimes I regret how I was raised or what I thought was true, and having spent so many years building up so many presuppositions that I later found to be not true or hindering or stultifying even. And then, but maybe that was the path I had to take in order to grow. Maybe it was unavoidable.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And that's, I guess that's the difficulty of it. But it's very interesting to me.
Yeah, it's a developmental model. That's the main thing that I think has to be emphasized, is that every place that any person is they're in for a reason, and that can go back to basically to the basic presuppositions of Calvinist determinism.
Right.
God is bringing everybody through the stage they need to be in.
So when I first heard of integral theory, to be honest, I got an overview of it from Ken Wilber, and then I read some of his books, and I was struck with a feeling of, it felt right to a degree. Like I felt like I was learning something that was somehow corresponding with reality, but I also felt lonely and scared. Does that make sense? And it took me a while, if I'm just being honest, and it took me a while to kind of adapt to work that into my way of thinking. And it also so happened that I was being introduced to it at a period of time in my life that was very sad for me, to say the least. I had a meaningful relationship that had just ended right around April of 2019. And so moving into this was very challenging for me. But right now I can see it. If I overlay a version, or, I might modify it and tailor it as I go, but I can overlay that over scripture, and I can see this same kind of developmental process. And when I've tried to share concepts of integral theory with other people who share my previous background, like independent Baptists, for example, they just started railing about how it was Hinduism and the devil and everything else, and that they could not hear me.
Well, are you or anyone in your audience familiar with James Fowler's Stages of Faith?
I am not.
Okay, well, that is an absolutely Christian. I don't even know if Fowler even knew about Wilber or integral theory, because he doesn't use integral language, but he talks about 7 stages of faith in an exact parallel way that Wilber understands integral, but without all the Hinduism. So if you want to talk to people about forget integral, just throw that word out. Just talk about developmental psychology as applied to stages of growth as a Christian. James Fowler is the dude. He's the go-to developmental psychologist in terms of Christian faith.
Yeah. Getting a call from somebody from my old church right now. Wisdom, intelligence, and rationality. What I picked up from the last meeting was that intelligence is your ability to thrive and survive, which may not necessarily correspond with reality. And rationality is means by which one can reliably end self-deception. And then wisdom would be a means by which somebody can perceive that which is real.
Right. Exactly right.
Okay.
That's all Vervecki, by the way. That's all from Vervecki.
Yeah. And then what is real might not necessarily be adaptive. So
that's right. In fact, often they're in direct contrast with each other.
Yeah. You familiar with Donald Hoffman?
I am familiar with Donald Hoffman, but I'm relying mostly for what my thinking in that area on the guy, his name slips my mind now, but yeah, Hoffman too. Yeah, Hoffman.
Yeah, he's trying to come up with a mathematical formula to demonstrate this, but he doesn't think that anything that we think we see is actually what is there. He thinks there's something real there, but it gets presented in our minds due to adaptivity or whatever, in a way that's different than how it fundamentally is. And this is not the same as simulation theory, even though there are a lot of similarities to it. What gets presented on my computer screen is not what's happening in the processor. And so if I wanted to, like my kids like to play Fortnite on PlayStation, if I wanted to do well at that game, it would not really help me to be thinking about the zeros and ones passing through transistors and processors and that sort of thing, and the graphics card. It wouldn't really help me to really understand that. You can do very well in the game and have no idea about any of that. But if I want to make a new game, I need to know something about that. Does that make sense? So if I want to switch between games or exercise a creative principle that creates a new game that can be played, I might need to know something, but I can adapt very well without corresponding to reality. And I feel like I see a lot of people going through life that way. They don't know what the base reality is that is undergirding our phenomenal experience, nor do they care.
There's also a cosmological piece to it, and that is evolution was the device that God, the random designer, created in order to stochastically get us to a moment where the human body was sufficiently developed vessel to receive what's called involution from the future, because the Holy Spirit draws us from the omega.
That's a new word for me.
Involution. Yeah, the Holy Spirit is drawing us or involving us from the future. And because of the fact, of course, that in the heavenly realm, in eternity, there is no time, the fact that we might say something like evolution goes forward and involution comes from the future, those things are completely irrelevant in the metaphysics of, God's reality. But the point is that evolution had to get our bodies to a point where there could be such a vessel as the human, the image and likeness of God, the human form, in order to receive God's spirit involved from the future. Of course, they didn't have all this metaphysical language back, late in antiquity when Genesis was being composed. But, now that we have this kind of metaphysical language to think about these things, I think we can get a better conception of the relationship between physical evolution and spiritual involution.
I mean, that makes me think of how your imaginary, your sacred second self, your imaginal sacred second self can be an endless repository of, transformation ammo, if you will.
Right. And that's the epictasis.
And you can be intentional about it.
That's St. Gregory of Nyssa's epictasis, the drawing from, or that constant spiritual, spiral evolution toward the future that's connected to that. Absolutely. I think that Nick talked about epictasis a little bit during our talk.
Yeah, I tried to bring it up a little bit, but one of the things that was really interesting to me that I wanted to throw out and try and revisit was the notion of with where you're talking about the Holy Spirit being in the future, kind of calling us, kind of wooing, I don't know what, convicting maybe, sure. different things like that. But
Whitehead would say prehending.
Yes, he would. Yes. So how that relates to the concept of time that you drew out from Mark 1:15. And so I was thinking about it today. So I work, my regular vocational job is I work in a maintenance department, but it's for buildings that provide residence and schooling for autistic children, right? So all across the autism spectrum. Turns out that autism is really hard to define. People really don't really know what it is, but regardless, there are some autistic kids who they functionally thrive off of having very specific time encapsulated tasks. So like they'll be if you tell them like, okay, we're going to go over your friend's house or something like that, they'll want to know exactly what time, and everything in their cognition will kind of revolve around the notion of having this time be fulfilled, right? So what I was thinking about today, vaguely and dimly, right, was something like why some people with like that have more like, I guess what you would call like OCD tendencies about the structure of fractionating the time in which they're embedded in, trying to fractionate it, how making something like time so fractionated and divorced from your embodiment, basically, how that affects their sense of fulfillment and meaning in things. Because I find that with some other, just some other people, autistic or not, that people who are very time oriented in terms of like fractionating and consolidating time tasks and things like that, that they have a hard time realizing meaningfulness in things. And so time can be a thing that stands still for them a lot of it.
You see how that connects to the autistic sensibility of dealing with combinatorial explosion of information, being able to memorize a whole list of the phone book, but not knowing the basic meaning behind what a phone number is all about. That, corresponds to that I wouldn't say inability, a different ability for understanding how to configure the combinatorial explosion of information with the time you have to deal with it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. So I see a lot of the kids and just certain people that I know that have these kinds of tendencies to be a lot more nihilistic in their interactions with things and with other people. And I just thought that was really interesting, because in terms of when you said that when the meaningfulness as the liquid is filled the soul, right? Time is fulfilled. The time is fulfilled. So you feel like you're in this flow state where when you get into a flow state, whether you do it, whether you can access it through playing music or sports, or if you're lucky enough in your job to have some kind of ability to enter into a flow state, we're finding out that you can enter into a flow state through conversation or dialogue, but that time seems to disappear. And that's why they say when you're having fun, time flies. And it has everything to do with the sense of fulfillment / meaning / purpose that you're getting out of the experience that you're in. And so it's kind of become a little bit incumbent upon my own like desires and what I want to share with people is that I'm not saying that I'm able to do this like it's at some above average rate, but I do know that there are certain things that I can induce this sense of timelessness and flow state through things like work, playing sports, listening to music, talking with other people, and that there's profound meaning and connectedness to be found in these moments. And that I want to be able to, as best I can, share that with other people and try and cultivate that in them, because it also affords me the ability to interact with people like that. So I just thought that the time thing with the jar was really awesome.
Yeah, what people mean nowadays when they say that very common phrase, I don't have enough time, what they really mean is I don't have enough meaning. I have a dearth of meaning in my life. I'm trying to eke meaning from moments that are becoming more and more meaningless. I don't have time.
Interesting.
I don't have enough meaning. Yeah, I was thinking the capacity for, when you're talking about autism, I'm not an expert on this at all, but the capacity for recognizing connections, recognizing analogies, recognizing patterns seems to be diminished with autistic people, and seems to be overdeveloped with psychotic people. Like the opposite end of the spectrum of autism would be in psychosis, where you have your crazy, not that all conspiracy theories are wrong, but your crazy conspiracy theorists who everything you talk to some people, you recognize them every once in a while, where everybody's out to get them, and it's not necessarily conspiracy theorists about the government or aliens or anything like that, but they're just, everything is interpreted in the worst possible lens, like it's out to get them. This paranoid conspiracy theory kind of thing, and this ability, so the ability to recognize patterns, to me, kind of correlates with sacraments as psychotechnologies, where you're able to see a pattern. Even the book of Hebrews says these things are a pattern of the heavenly things. And the description there are things ceremonial done in religion, where you do sacrifices on an altar. Those would be sacramental, those would be ceremonial and participated in by a community. And it's the recognition of the pattern that makes it meaningful. Makes sense? So there comes the meaning.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
I'm still struggling with people who are so caught up on ontological propositions that they can't conduct the four kinds of knowing, perspectival parallax, if you will, with somebody else. They can't allow parallax from somebody else to kind of fill things in for them or help see a new way. Now, I wrote down in my notes that I sent to Nick the phrase avoidance mode. And what I realized, especially with some of the complaints that I get from some of the later conversations we've been having on the channel, is if you talk about something, people say, oh, that sounds too Roman Catholic for me. If you talk about something else, oh, that sounds like the prosperity gospel. You talk about something else, oh, that sounds like the emerging church. You talk about something else, that sounds like JWs, that sounds like Calvinist, that sounds like what's the latest one? New Age, that kind of thing. So it's almost like when I was a dogmatic fundamentalist, I literally spent more time avoiding certain things than pursuing anything. Does that make sense? So I was more afraid to say something and be perceived as one of these bad things, be perceived as a New Ager, or be perceived as emerging church, or be perceived as there's this long list of bad things that you can't be. And of course, if there is a paradigm of thought, it probably converges on some truth somewhere. So at some point in time, you're going to sound like that thing. But I don't think that's a good way to live, to be avoiding all these things all the time. And I don't know if either one of you have any comments or thoughts about what kind of a balance a Christian could formulate in their life to where they are able to explore while they're not stultified by fear of being all these boogeymen, while also not going off the path. How does somebody calibrate that?
Well, I will make just a brief comment that I've always had the intuition that fundamentalists are terrified of Darwinism and evolutionary theory, not because of the theory itself, but because what you begin to understand about natural selection and the way living things fill niches in the environment is that the exact same parallel process happens in the development of religion. That is, there are no unnecessary religions. Every religious movement, every religious society is basically filling some kind of social niche that people are responding to. So the JWs aren't wrong. The Mormons aren't wrong. The Calvinists aren't wrong. What each of these groups is doing is filling a sociological niche through some particular religious ideology. If you can face that fact, if you can come face to face with the absolute terror that all of these propositions in religion are actually doing a service for the community that they've emerged from, for their evolutionary imperatives, then your whole propositional structure is completely decimated.
Well, if you see a proposition as an ontological truth claim, someone's going to take a whole lot of issue with what you just said.
Exactly. And seeing a proposition as an ontological truth claim has the exact parallel in biology as seeing a species as unable to evolve.
Yeah. Yeah. Can you double click on that for a second?
What do you mean?
What
is that?
Kind of explain that a little bit.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, what you just said it perfectly. The same terror that it's possible that species can evolve against the Aristotelian presumption that there were just, fixed entities. It's the same terror to think that my propositions or my entire ideology that's based on these premises can also evolve and change and shift and be modified according to the sociological cultural needs of my community.
So if you're looking at Mormonism and you disagree with that planet Kolob is being, populated with spirit babies by an eternally pregnant godmother, you may disagree with that proposition as an ontological truth claim, but then you would, so help me with this, you would understand that proposition not as an ontological truth claim, but as a placeholder serving some kind of role for the development of mankind?
Yes, I can give you an exact evolutionary parallel. Okay, what are the skills that are necessary for survival in the natural world? You need cunning, computational thinking, etc. And all of these means are ways to achieve evolutionary goals, evolutionary imperatives. The same thing with the planet Kolob and any other kind of propositions that a cult or a movement might come up with. If those propositions are fulfilling the needs of meaning, if it becomes meaningful for the community, meaning is the stuff, it's the nourishment upon which a community thrives. So if that community is gaining wisdom and meaning from a proposition, no matter how absurd to any other community, if it's serving the purpose of sense making to that community, it's serving the exact same parallel function in evolution as the various, adaptive skills that are necessary for a species to survive in its niche.
So when I think of, I've never thought about the meaning aspect before. I may need to look at it, because the way I see
sense making, you can replace the word sense making as well.
Well, the way I understand it is an in-group is adaptable for the sake of survivability, no matter what they believe. And if you have a false mythopoetic narrative that ties a group of people together, they are more adaptable to survive because they are together, and the function that narrative serves to tie them together is not related to how true it is. It's related to how much it ties them together.
That's
so right. Where does meaning come into that? Is that correlative, or is the tying together, is that the meaning? Where's the meaning in this?
So the meaning plays the same role that meaning plays in science. Okay, so with science, you're working purely off intelligence, right? And you're still trying to achieve certain evolutionary imperatives. Now, there's a degree to which the scientific method does seek to avoid self-deception, but mostly what it's about, it's finding meaning in the various hypotheses that it's proving. So the only difference between the scientific enterprise and scientific method in terms of its use of meaning and the kind of the wisdom path, or searching for metaphysical meaning, is that kind of the ultimate ends of meaning, sense making for the religionist or for the wisdom seeker is that it's working off metaphysical propositions that can't be proven. So metaphysical propositions are, they're unfalsifiable claims. Right. Whereas meaning making in science, what you're doing with a hypothesis is you're actually proposing falsifiable claims. And that's what you want to keep doing with the scientific method. Right, but with wisdom seeking, what you're doing is you're just putting out there on this impossible vanishing point on the horizon, these unfalsifiable metaphysical claims that still provide you with that metaphysical meaning your community needs to both survive and to make sense of reality.
I don't know. Maybe we said the word too much and it doesn't make sense to me anymore. But how do I know when something is delivering meaning?
When something feels real. Meaning puts us in contact with the real. And Vervecki, he gives a great example of what's real. He uses this example in his lecture series. If he had a bird, right? And I guess he tore its wings off and its legs off and its beak off, separately, all these things, disattached would not be the bird. It only becomes a bird when all these elements come together in an integrated whole. So something is meaningful when it comes together as an integrated whole, such that it gives you a larger scope of seeing what being is, or reality, or wholeness.
Yeah,
it's a higher revelation of being, which is what the whole history of consciousness just is. The entire history of consciousness is merely the adventure of the human soul getting a wider and wider and broader perspective on the nature of being.
About 5 years ago, if I was going to walk into a church, I would be very preoccupied with the things that place says they believe. And then I had a perspective change, I guess in 2019, where I suddenly, for the first time ever, felt like I could walk into any church, and no matter what you see around, typically a church will have some kind of representation of a cross. And no matter what these people say they believe, they are all, every Sunday morning, they are choosing, the Bible says in Hebrews 12:3, consider him who endured such a contradiction of sinners. But regardless of what I think about what these people believe, all these people are coming together and they are considering him. That's exactly what they're doing. They're looking forward toward this cross, and they're considering this man, Jesus Christ. And regardless of what else I think about what they believe, that unity in diversity, if you will, that's beautiful. And I enjoy that. I don't know why I enjoy that. I just do, and I find something uplifting about that thought, and sitting in that thought when I'm in a situation like that, especially if I'm in a place that is historically disagreed with the propositions that I was raised with.
Yeah, that's why Paul says, whether in pretense or in truth, if Christ be preached, then I think, what does he say? I rejoice, something like that.
Yeah,
I think
Philippians, I think 3 or so. Yeah.
Well, I think there's something to be said about the 4 levels of knowing there. And that is, I just don't think very many evangelicals and fundamentalists have reached that level of awareness to understand that the knowing they experience, the kind of knowing that you just expressed, knowing Christ in this context actually does involve all 4 levels of knowing. So the way it's usually expressed in religious studies is they talk about belief, behavior, and belonging. Well, belief, behavior, and belonging all correspond. The belief, of course, refers to the propositional knowing, but the behavior refers to the procedural knowing, what you're actually doing in the congregation in order to worship, and the order of worship. That's the procedural knowing. No matter how limited your liturgy, even if it's a completely minimalistic low church liturgy, you still have some procedural knowing going on at the level of behavior. And then at the level of belonging, that's where you've got your perspectival knowing, because you're belonging to this particular set of people worshiping Jesus in this way. And then at the very root, you have the participatory knowing, which kind of ties that whole hierarchy together. So the thing is that I was an evangelical for many years, so I'm speaking from first person perspective. I came to understand and realize when I was growing in the faith that those levels of knowing weren't even spoken about. They were tacit. They were just assumed, and that the only real level of knowing that was valued was the propositional level.
Propositional, right.
Yeah,
I think that's one of the things. So if I heard you correctly, did you say a couple minutes ago that meaning comes from what seems to us to be real?
Meaning bestows reality upon our life. So there's this kind of arena out there. There's this field of being that we can't make sense of. The only way we make sense of it is through our five senses. So there's this field of being coming into the five senses. And the function of meaning is to make something real for ourselves and our experience out of that field of experience that we're encountering. And that's the agent arena relationship. So the agent, through the flow state, through engaging with reality, through having a meaningful engagement with reality, usually through a flow state, is creating meaning for oneself by encountering that vast field of noumena that has no, no referent.
Yeah. I have so many things going through my head right now. There's part of me that thinks that, if I define truth as correspondence with reality, there's part of me that wants to know what is really true. And then there's a part of me that wants to be loyal to the origin stories of my fundamentalist Christian background. And then there's another part of me that kind of sees religion, any kind, as something that could completely have evolved because of its adaptability, that people like integral theory, you basically, these belief systems and gods and goddesses arise as they provide adaptability and meaning at some level for the people that are involved in them. And I feel like I'm holding them both at the same time without necessarily feeling like I have to identify with either. And I'm tempted to lie to myself and to my audience so that I can have more people relate to me, or certain people that I'm comfortable with or more familiar with relate to me, because their in groups are normalized by affirming certain propositions, which I can understand, but don't feel like I have to identify myself with.
I think we're forgetting about one element in that agent arena relationship, and that's the signifiers that mediate the agent in the arena. Okay, so you have this arena, and that's this vast field of mysterious being that can't be known directly. Okay, so let's call that God or the metaphysical object beyond perception. Yeah. The only way we can access that field is through signifiers. Those signifiers are usually represented through propositions. Okay, the signifiers are not the truth themselves, right? But there are only access to the truth, and they're absolutely necessary to limning or adumbrating the truth. The only way we can adumbrate anything about that metaphysical.
What word is that? Adumbrate?
Adumbrate, to limb, to kind of suggest, but not know directly, right?
Oh, I don't. I'm adding that to my vocabulary list.
Okay, so you've got this vast metaphysical object beyond perception, which can't be known directly. You have signifiers that can be known directly, but don't tell the absolute truth. And then you have the agent that's seeking truth. Okay. So this is why the proposition often the biggest mistake is to mistake the propositions for the metaphysical object they represent.
Absolutely.
Right. Okay. So this is the whole thing is there is an absolute truth, but the absolute truth is only an emergence of the relationship between these 3 points of information. You have to have the agent, the signifiers, and the field. In that perichoretic or Trinitarian relationship, the truth emerges. But the truth isn't one single. That's why, the truth, I think, at the bottom is Trinitarian rather than Unitarian, because it involves this communicative three-way signal between, let's say, if we want to use Christian language, the Father is that metaphysical object beyond time. The signifier, that's the Logos. The revelation of the Holy Spirit in me.
Yeah, that absolutely. And you see the concept of three things all throughout nature. Even time is past, present, and future, things like that.
Right.
So the signifiers in the field, from my background, and we do things exposing other, propositional belief systems that we don't believe to be true. It seems like we sometimes confuse the signifiers for the field itself.
Exactly. That's the whole problem with fundamentalism, is to mistake the signifier for the signified. That's it in a nutshell.
Yeah, and like Jordan Hall says, I can point at the moon, and you might confuse my pointer with the moon, and that's the mistake. Look at what I'm pointing at. Don't look at the pointer. And words are pointers. They point towards something.
That's the logos.
Yeah.
The word. Yeah.
Yeah. I have too many thoughts go through my head in order to be productive and functional right now. I do want to talk about the Perusia though. So for anybody in the audience who may not know this, some people took issue with Seraphim's reference to the second coming of Christ being the church, right? And for fundamentalist Christian, it's, one of the 5 fundamentals of the faith is the bodily return of Christ, based on passages like Acts 1 and some others as well.
There's nothing not bodily about the body of Christ.
What's that?
If anything is bodily, it's the body of Christ, the church.
Yeah, maybe that's the most bodily thing. I mean, Jordan Peterson talks about the hyper object or the archetype sometimes as being more real than any particular instantiation of a thing. Like that which is common among all fathers, for example, is more real than any particular father, because it's spread across more time and space, and it's more likely to interface with that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I got some pushback from some of our audience members because they basically they're looking at propositions and they're looking, well, my proposition, my background says this, and this guy is basically, I guess, kind of an amillennial standpoint. So the funny thing about me is that personally, I kind of hold both in my head. And what I mean by that is, if you look at, say, Viktor Frankl, and he talks about man's search for meaning, he's in the concentration camp, and he noticed that people who are looking for just escapism, they're just looking for that deliverance, they wound up losing hope and committing suicide. And so but when he emphasized being and nobody can take your integrity from you, and those kind of people who tried to make the best of every day, regardless of whether or not they ever got rescued, those people survived and they wound up getting rescued. So I kind of see, like, whether or not a person believes, whatever a person believes about eschatology or the end times or the return of Christ or not, or what that is, I think that it is every Christian's duty and purpose to participate in the life that now is in bringing together the assembly of believers to the full stature of the image of Christ. Now, whether that is the second coming or whether that happens and the second coming is something else, frankly, I kind of don't care, because it doesn't affect what I have to do. Does that make sense? I have to coordinate with other believers and do this Ephesians 4:16 edification model, where every joint is supplying edification to everybody else. And we have to be conducting discernment. We have to be speaking the truth in love. Everybody has to be involved. We all have to upregulate our capacity to be involved in such a thing. And in my mind, I kind of see a coalescence of this body of Christ that is this formidable thing in the future, almost like a collective intelligence that may one day be going up against the, GTP3 algorithms or something like that. I don't know, but I kind of see this as a formidable thing that will have agency in the world, irrespective of my belief on eschatology. And I think that every Christian's duty is to try to participate in that thing. I don't see it as having to, I don't know. I see it as like a both and thing, more so than an either or thing.
Yeah, I think this ties really, really tightly into what I was at least attempting to say about the autistic sort of tendencies to, or OCD tendencies to fractionate time and to like put all of one's relevance realization or make salient like the moment when it turns 3 o'clock, when I get to go to my friend's house. And so from the time period of 12 o'clock to 3 o'clock, it's like the longest 3 hours ever. And so that the relationship between looking forward into the future and fixating on a moment,
one particular punctiliar thing.
Yeah, in time, that is, again, it's kind of like staying in prehension mode without ever allowing for
no concrescence.
Right, exactly. And so
which is horrible.
It's which means there's no substance to your life. There's no substance there's no liquid that's filling your jar and giving you this sense of meaning. And so, I think that what you're saying about the hyper focus on this very elusive and kind of I think it might just be a distractor is what I'm getting at. And it disorients. And if it disorients, that means you don't know what to aim at in a present tense moment. And if you don't know what to orient towards, which should be the things that are sacred in the present tense moment, not these, imaginal senses of propositional words that are sacred, in the Bible, and hyper focusing on those things whilst all of reality passes you by, through your salience landscape.
That's exactly right.
Then you don't know in that present tense moment what is sacred, like what's important, like the person in front of you who needs your attention because they're going through some kind of crisis. And, so I think that such a deep focus on those things is disorienting, and it strips out a person's ability to stay aimed at a particular sacred thing and cultivate meaning or religio with that the image of that thing, that archetype. So you know what I'm saying? Like, you don't get to participate with the archetype of the thing.
So let me try to word that a different way. If I can. Christians a lot of times say things like pray as if it all depends on God and act as if it all depends on you. I think that every Christian should act as if the body of the church is the only second coming we will ever get. Does that make sense? I think we should act as if that is the case. What I see in my background, fundamentalism, a lot of Southern gospel songs are all about heaven. There's not a lot of encouragement about how to live a wise life here. And I think that wisdom is recursive, if you will. Like if I get wisdom, maybe I can pass more to my kids than was passed to me, and maybe they can pass more to the next generation. And when I see these people who are in their 70s and 80s, who they've spent the last 60 years just kind of waiting around for Christ to come back and haven't really exercised the agency they have or increased the capacity for agency in their life, they are wasting the opportunity that they have. And it's a waste. It's absolute disorientation. And you could say that a misapplication of this focus on heaven and the afterlife and the rapture and the second coming is that it causes people who are nothing other than a bump on a log, who don't ever do anything to help others transform or to become like Christ. They don't do anything toward that. They help, maybe they help install propositions in people's heads, but there's no qualitative transformation in involvement. And it's like this just completely wasted life that occurred with someone who was under the illusion that they had more abundant life, but you could never see it. It's somebody else's turn.
Yeah, well, I'll just share this little story then that happened to me today that I shared with Kevin earlier. But I work with some people who are definitely in this fundamentalist kind of mindset. And I don't want to use the word fundamentalist mindset. I'm gonna say they're in a mindset where reality, their perceptions of reality is unidimensionally reduced down to propositional utterances that they can hear and that other people can espouse. So, for example, there's a
theological flatland.
Nice.
That's a great. I'm stealing that.
Like a desert, yeah, a theological flat desert, the wilderness, perhaps. So there's a woman that works with us who identifies as a witch, okay? And so in their theological, what did you call it? Flatland. The theological
flatland, right? One-dimensional theology.
Yeah. So in their theological flatland, that is all that she is. Like, that's it, because that's all that she says is, like, she lets everybody know that she's a witch, and, she dresses like one, her car is like one, blah, blah, blah. And what happened today was, because in their world, in their propositionally reduced world, she's going, there's a story, there's a narrative about her, where she's going and what, all of what she's worth and all of what she is. So she is responsible for taking care of some of the autistic kids. And she went to lunch today, and so she lives right around the corner. So she goes home for lunch. Her longtime cat she just found her cat dead. And then so she came back to work, and she was frantic, like out of control, crying, like distraught. And what they saw was like their sense of like karma or God's judgment coming down upon her. And it was like, okay, yeah, like in a sense that's right, because what's happened is she, something that's meaningful to her, very deeply meaningful, like her cat, that relationship has been cut off. And so part of her is in this mode where she doesn't know who she is. She doesn't know how to construct reality. She doesn't know how to act. She doesn't know how to behave. So she's distraught. And these are Christian men, so-called Christian men, emissaries of Christ, little Christ, whatever you want to, sons of God, whatever you want to call it. And they're sitting there looking at her in judgment and not equipped, right, to deal with this situation in a way that would be becoming of
no compassion, no empathy, no sympathy for a human being who just lost their pet.
That's right. In the middle of work, right? Like, had this happen. So, like, I'm just saying, I went up to her, like gave her a hug, and like she's at the point where like she uses all kinds of perfume. And so her perfumes were like on me for the rest of the day. And it's like, I could see their disgust mechanisms, just like, like that, like getting triggered, like, oh dude, you smell like her now. And it's like, what is wrong with you, man? Like so this unidimensional way of looking at the world based on their self-righteous notions of God, don't allow them, right? It doesn't allow them to even consider something
the humanity
like
of that person.
Right. Or that the like it's such a small sacrifice of letting yourself smell like a certain way for the sake of trying to at least bring a sense of reality back into this person's maps of meaning, like, hey, like you need to go home, go grieve, go do this, not just sit there and stay in this propositionally erected ideological structure and throw moralistic catapults at her. You know what I'm saying? It was really disturbing for me today. So their sense of meaning, right? So what was meaningful for them was the pain and disorientation and dehumanization of another person. That's what was meaningful for them.
And there's professing Christians doing this
in that situation.
Yeah, but if your narrative tells you thou shalt not suffer a witch to live, it makes sense within that narrative framework. There's nothing wrong with that,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, according to that narrative. I mean, if we were to approach it through integral theory, you have these three stages. You've got mythological thinking, in which mythos dominates. And I would also want to actually throw in the factor of like form versus substance. So for any meaning, there's a form that meaning takes, but then there's the substance of the meaning. So the substance of the meaning is the logos, and the form is the mythos. Okay, we have to spend a long time as individuals and as a culture trying on, just like we try on different costumes, trying on different forms to know some particular substance. We got to a point in the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution when we realized what was really important was the substance. It was the meaning. It was the logos. And so what we tried to do is we tried to dismiss and actually kind of completely reject all forms, all myths, because we thought the essence of what we needed was the logos. So the genius of integral theory is that it saves the appearances, to use the great expression from Owen Barfield. In other words, it goes back and retrieves those myths, understands that they were just the casing, the kind of form of the logical substance. It keeps the methods of science, understanding that it's the logic, that it's the logos that it's important, because it's the logos that points to that metaphysical object that everything is trying to describe. But then it weaves all the stories together to say, yes, we need narratives, but the narratives are relative. I mean, the logos is absolute and the narratives are relative. So if you're still stuck either, within kind of a narrative structure that, let's say it's the Wiccan narrative structure, you've got certain signifiers, you've got a grammar of signifiers there. And if you're like some, deeply evangelical fundamentalist, you've got a grammar of signifiers there. Within the grammar of signifiers of the myth of evangelicalism, again, witches are the enemy, witches are the other. So, I mean, it's not completely illogical if you haven't reached the point where you understand that what you really want is the substance or the meaning, to reject someone and not to see that that's an uncompassionate thing,
Right. It's just that within the narrative framework, there's also the simultaneous contradiction of Jesus's in the Gospels, his treatment of the other. Right.
Right.
So,
but Jesus never, the thing I'm talking about is the signifier witch. So there are no witch narratives in the New Testament.
Right.
The only thing that somebody basing their, if you have this this symbolic signifier, witch, where do you go to? You go back in your inventory of symbols. There's nothing in the New Testament that registers. There is something in the Old Testament. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. Okay, that's how we're going to treat it, right? Because, I mean, what propositions does the New Testament say specifically about witches? I'm not talking about the other. I think that's too abstract a thought to expect from a mythical thinker, that a witch would be the other. A mythical thinker is going to frame this person as a witch, not as some other I have to be compassionate toward. That sensibility is too integral.
Yeah, the New Testament, I think, only mentions pharmakia in the book of Revelation, if I'm not mistaken.
Sorcery.
So what kind of stuck out to me while I'm hearing both of you is the concept of values. Like, what do I value more? Do I value being compassionate to another human being, or do I value allegiance to my propositionally normative in group? What do I value more? And I I think that being compassionate to another human being as a human would be more valuable than one's persistence in outgrouping somebody else because their propositions they espouse happen to be different than yours. And then I guess it would be an integral growing up thing to where you get the person to where they have such values. And how would you prompt a person to grow into that without just virtue signaling them, but to really feel them? I mean, essentially, you're looking at a Good Samaritan scenario. That there's the person that the whole society is supposed to hate, but somebody sees the human being in them and goes and helps them anyway. And it happens to be somebody you think is the enemy. Overcoming in-group, out-group boundaries to see the humanity in somebody else. I think that's highly valuable.
Yeah, I would extend that and say that this is just kind of coming to me as you were saying that, but I'm interested in transcending my values sets, or my I guess you would say I'm interested in transcending my virtue, my sense of virtue, right? Through what values are salient to me in a situation, rather than valuing something, basically a meaningless pointer to that virtue or to that value set, if that makes any sense.
Well, I mean, I'm honestly struggling a little bit here how you can have a meaningless point. What I thought I was hearing earlier was that any kind of belief system has some kind of meaning for some people who are in it. And so how could you have a meaningless pointer? Is it different degrees of meaning
Yeah,
that is appropriate to a certain stage of development?
I'm thinking of Paul's usage of like vain babblings, like the vanity of empty words, that kind of notion,
Yeah, profane and vain babblings. Yeah.
Right. So I think it would be vain and empty if the pointer is completely misaligned with within, when Seraphim was talking about the agent, what was in it, like the logos and the
signifier, right?
Signifier, right? When the signifier in no way makes way for a conduit for that agent arena attunement, it would be empty, like there's nothing coming through it, an empty word or pointer to the thing, completely misused.
Well, the scriptures are combinatorial explosive in terms of meaning. So you can look at the scriptures and take any meaning whatsoever, depending on what's relevant for you. And so, in terms of those who are bound to a mythical narrative, compassion is very low on your salience landscape. What's really high is being moral, being, anti-sorcerer, whatever it is that, compassion is like down here. I don't think compassion reaches a real kind of salience until you get to the integral stage where you begin to see that kind of, compassion really comes to the fore in the salience landscape, and all these kind of moralistic, judgmental type values take a far back seat.
So what I want to do, Seraphim, if I may put you on the spot a little bit, a lot of people are going to be hung up on certain propositions that they disagree with. And what I'd like to do is get over that. So I want to ask you, we're at the 1.5 hour mark, and I'd like to wrap this up, but I'd like to ask you a couple of things about wisdom. Number one, what would you say briefly a person could do to cultivate wisdom in their own life? And what could a person do to help cultivate wisdom in other people's lives?
Yeah, great. Just develop ecologies of practice that promote and encourage virtue. The virtues are the royal road to wisdom. So the more ecologies of practice that you can collate and, engage proactively, the closer you'll get to wisdom. wisdom. It's kind of circular in that wisdom encourages and supports the virtues, and the virtues stimulate and generate wisdom. And those are done through ecologies of practice.
What, can you rattle off a list of virtues?
Sure. Mercy, temperance, prudence, courage, patience, forbearing, among many others.
Yeah. Okay.
Forbearance, I mean. Yep. Yeah. Uh-huh.
So we want practices that promote these kinds of virtues.
Right. And in the traditional religions, Christianity, Sufism, Buddhism, what we find are, whole traditions that have, like, libraries, archives of centuries and centuries of practicing and, through and learning through trial and error, which ecologies of practice and which sacraments and which psychotechnologies are most conducive toward the propagation and generation of virtues, and then on to wisdom.
Yeah, that sounds like something I can hold. And a lot of times when people talk about wisdom, I don't feel like I can hold what they said. And now I want to focus outward a little bit for the second part of that question. What can we do to inspire others to also try to be on a journey of wisdom cultivation when they seem to reject every offer of it?
Yeah, the thing you begin to realize as you grow in consciousness, especially as you reach the integral and transcendent levels, is that the real connections, the real connectivity between us is not at a dianoetic level. It's not occurring at the level of intelligence. Our connection is actually at this noetic level, which is beyond our sight. So the nous is what the ancient Greeks described as the eye of the spirit. It's kind of a different, you could call it a different dimension, a different plane of reality in which we are all already one. In a mystical dimension, the body of Christ is whole. The epokatastasis has occurred. God is already all in all. We only see this fallen world through the eyes of the ego, or as St. Paul put it, the eyes of the flesh. The flesh and egoism are interchangeable terms. We only see a broken, shattered, separated world because we're looking at it from our fallenness, the eyes of the flesh, through egoism. Were we to repair and restore and do an act of what the Jews, the Kabbalists called tikkun olam, which is the reparation of the world, we would understand that all things are already perfect and whole. And so what we need to do is, again, cultivate that wisdom. And at the level of cultivation of wisdom, we will grow in the fullness and stature of Christ. And that will amplify, that will fill our knowledge of the nous will be filled, the nous will be illumined. And then in that illumination, we're going to see that we're already connected.
I don't talk about this a lot, but I had an experience one time. I was driving and I was doing something prescriptively that was repetitive in my mind. And as I was driving, I had this otherworldly experience where I saw every face in the world as if it was my own. And I can't explain that to anybody, but I saw them all at the same time and all at one time. And everything was, everybody was one person. And there was enmity, not really enmity, but even people that I had enmity with, it was all the same. And I felt like I understood and empathized with everything about them. And it happened for like 10 seconds. And I don't know how or why that happened, but it was very shaking, and it is hard not to get emotional thinking about it. I can't use that as authoritative for people from my background to try to tell them anything, but it has really shaped what I see. So when you talk about this oneness thing, I feel like I have a firsthand experience with having seen something like that. And there's part of me that knows it, even though I can't prove it and could not win an argument for it.
Oh, I could tell you exactly what it is, actually. Take an infant. when an infant is born, you know that an infant can speak every language already.
Yeah, every phenome.
Exactly, right. Every phoneme we already know. And what happens is it's a process of elimination by which we get narrowed into some specific language. Okay, it's the exact same thing with identity. When a child is born, each of us was already everybody. And what we gradually learned to do was narrow the purview of our identity so that we became this particular person with this particular name. But when we started out in our essence, I was everybody there is, in the same way that I spoke every language. And it was only through the process of acculturation that I became narrowed into an identity. So that's what you went back to. And that's what we're striving to do in spiritual practice, is we're striving to recover that essence with which we first began. And this is exactly what the Lord meant when he said, become like a little child. It means go back to that essential primordial point when you were born, when you were potentially everybody and anybody.
I think you guys are just lending credence to the Calvinist notion of Adam as the federal head.
I'm anticipating. No, I'm just anticipating. Like I'm completely jiving with what's being said and felt here, and I'm anticipating a bunch of accusations of Hinduism and New Age and stuff coming in the comments.
All it is it's mystical Christianity. It's right, just it's the same Christianity that we've believed all along, but that we forgot, especially due to so many waves of history have covered it over. Scholasticism and then the Protestant Reformation. But I mean, if you go back and you look at the fathers, you read the Desert Fathers, you read some of those original monks, you read the Philokalia of the Eastern Orthodox Church, it's all there. Mm-hmm. We've just forgotten in the West. We've forgotten.
I had a conversation recently where somebody, I've been Paul, Acts 17, in him we live, move, and have our being. And I've been kind of dismayed. If I go to a church service, I see people talking and singing about God as if it's this thing that's outside of you. But it is him which worketh in you, both to will and to do of his good pleasure. If you really want to find God, he's everywhere. Yes, you need to look outside, but you also need to look inside. And the tradition from which I came, in my opinion, seems to neglect the necessity to look inside for God working in through, in him we live, move, and have our being, that kind of thing. Which, if you look to the inside, that's when people start accusing you of being a mystic. And that's one of those things you're supposed to avoid because it's a boogeyman, and that's demonic and it's of the devil. So I feel kind of stultified to grow and explore. I used to be a pastor, and I found myself holding back on a lot of things that I wouldn't say or even explore, because I knew my in-group would not accept that. And if I'm honest, I find myself doing that now with my YouTube audience. I know the direction that I need to go and explore and discover more truth and better correspondence with reality. And I have an attachment to and a fear of what other people think.
I think, though, in the history of Western culture, we had to do this. It was inevitable that there was a prodigal son moment in which we reached the farthest extent of materialism, fundamentalism, individualism. We had to see the farthest extent of taking things this way so that we could return and recover all those mystical intuitions with which the church started.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I know we got to go soon, but I just remember, Seraphim, you mentioning that in your endeavors to sort of do set up mutually beneficial wisdom trainings, right? That you've changed the names of different things, the propositions of propositional pointers of what you were trying to do, which in some ways kind of feels like it resonates with kind of what Kevin is getting at in terms of what he's experienced. So I was just wondering, like, why you felt like that was a thing to do and how it helped or didn't help?
It's going to be something that we all do. The entire human race is evolving. It's just, maybe Kevin and I are at the vanguard. I don't know why we got there before others, but it's going to be everybody. Fundamentalists are just in the 3rd grade. We happen to be in the 10th grade, but everybody's going to get to the point that we've arrived at now. It's called spiritual growth. It's inevitable. It can't not happen. This is my Calvinist point. God, the hound of heaven, the hound of heaven is driving us toward the evolution of consciousness. Okay.
That's funny. It's funny to have built a YouTube channel around anti-Calvinism and to also see signal in it at the same time. All right. Thanks so much for impromptu coming on here, Seraphim. Just out of the chat, coming back. I figured, why not? If you're there already, why not, right?
Yeah, it was great.
The conversations that we've had, you definitely given me a whole lot to think about, and I'm sure that's true with everybody else. I'll leave it to I'll go with Nick and then Seraphim. If y'all have any last final words before we sign off for the day.
Yeah, for me, the biggest thing missing in this little trialogue here was definitely a look into something like dialogos and how that plays a role in like some of the things we were talking about. I know that there was a sense of a need to kind of, like comb back the ruffled feathers or something like that. But ultimately, trying to make disclaimers or like shift like other people's ability or afford somebody the ability to look at something from a different perspective is necessary.
Yep.
But it's definitely not the meaty stuff. It's definitely not the stuff where we're really getting into what I think Paul is relaying as the structural and functionality of the body of Christ, and the notion that, or the significance that dialogos plays in that structural function. So that's something that I think was definitely missing, but I'd like to start diving into in the future.
Yeah. Any parting words, Seraphim?
Yeah, I just want to say that if anybody in your audience was kind of enticed, intrigued by anything that I was saying, we have ecologies of practice and psychotechnologies practicing throughout the week with my organization, which is Wisdom Awakening.
Awakening. Okay.
Yeah, Wisdom Awakening. If anybody's interested in cultivating wisdom, in growing in the fullness and stature of Christ, we have very specific, practical, hands-on, boots in the ground psychotechnologies for developing that. We do it throughout the week. So just have maybe your viewers, I could put my email, you can give them my email, or I have a website which is in transition now, so I don't want to give that out just yet, but email would be the best right now.
Email would be the best. You want me to go ahead and give them your email? You're okay with that?
Yeah, that's fine.
I mean, you can just say it if you want.
Seraphim.winslow@gmail.com.
Seraphim.winslow@gmail.com. And what I will do is I will post this in the chat in case people want to see this. And after the video goes, I'll go back and edit the description.
Great.
So that people can reach out to you. So Wisdom Awakening, that's what the name of it's called?
Yeah. It used to be called the Rose of Zion Wisdom School, but people were triggered by the word Zion. So I decided I had to change it.
All right. All right. You'll actually probably see me there. I'm very curious in this, very interested in this.
Oh, you have a full invitation. I would love to have you. You can ask Nick. Nick's been to a few sessions, so we know. Yeah.
Oh, I would love that.
Yeah.
I would love that.
Okay, great.
All right, gentlemen. Thanks so much for joining me impromptu to have this conversation. It means a lot. And may the Lord bless you. And